Hi, let's talk about the cell. This is the basic unit of life, right? So anything that is living is going to contain at least one cell, making it one of those basic principles for life on Earth. So the fundamental unit of life states that all living organisms are made up of at least one cell, that all cells would descend from a common ancestor. And what this means is that life on Earth started from a unicellular organism, and all the rest of life develops from these types of unicellular organisms. And cells share common features, which means all cells are going to contain things that are similar from one cell to another. And we're going to look at these common features that cells share. So please know these three fundamental units of life. Microscopy is a way we can use to look at cells. So a microscope is basically an instrument that is used for looking at things that you can't see very well with the naked eye or at all with the naked eye. And we have different types of microscopes. Light microscopes is what you would commonly find in a seated laboratory class, in which you would be looking through this microscope at microorganisms. Okay, so you might look at things like the fruit fly. You might look at the structures of a fruit fly that you won't be able to see with your naked eye. You could look at cells of an organism, including human tissue cells, which are too small to be able to see. You could also look at things like dust mites. That's right. There are actual mites or insects in the dust all around us every second of every day. And you can see these in a class looking under a light microscope. I would suggest, if you're interested, look up microscopic organisms online and you can see an array of different organisms. The light microscope is what we most commonly will use. And so here, this chart on the left shows you what things you can see with the naked eye. For instance, a chicken egg, obviously you can see with the naked eye. Frog eggs are smaller, but you can still see them. And a human egg is possible to see with the naked eye, but is quite small. Past that, if you wanted to look at the details, say, of a human egg, you would have to use the light microscope. So in light microscope, you can see things like most plant and animal cells, some bacterial cells, and some structures within the cell. For anything smaller than that, for instance, viruses and parts of cells, you would actually need to use what is called an electron microscope. And so an electron microscope actually uses electrons to scan and transmit the images back to you. They're used to see objects like organelles that are just too small to see with the light microscope. Okay. Now, going back to cells, what we're mostly looking at today is what is a cell and how we can structure different life on Earth within these groups of cells. So cells can be divided into two major categories. All cells on Earth are either prokaryotic cells or eukaryotic cells. A good way to remember the difference is to know what these prefixes mean. So pro means before, and karyote refers to nucleus. So prokaryotic cells are the cells that exist before a true nucleus. So these prokaryotic cells are going to belong to the simpler organisms. These organisms will have no membrane-bound organelles, and they are going to be unicellular, which means they will only be one cell big. Okay. They're not going to have a true nucleus, so no nucleus. Instead, they're going to contain a nucleus, which means their DNA will be kind of concentrated in like this kind of weird mass in the middle of their cell. This is different from your eukaryotic cells. The prefix "eu" means true. Karyote, again, referring to cell. And these are the more larger or more complex organisms. These are going to have membrane-bound organelles or membrane-enclosed organelles, which means that their smaller structures within the cell can then have its own membrane protecting it. Okay. And these are going to be either unicellular or multicellular. So you're going to find both unicellular and multicellular organisms in the eukaryotes, but only unicellular organisms for your prokaryotes. Lastly, I want you to understand that the first organisms on Earth were all prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells developed after that. So we have life first appear on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. About 2.1 billion years ago is when the first eukaryotic cells started to develop. So let's look at these two types of cells in more detail. But before we do that, I want you to understand a little bit about why cell size matters. Okay. Some cells will be really small, some cells may be larger than that. For instance, you saw that a chicken egg on this graph back here can actually be seen with the naked eye. Frog eggs can also be seen with the naked eye, but anything quite smaller than that, you're going to need a light microscope to be able to see it. So cells can be quite small. For instance, the cells of your skin are so small you can't see it with your own eye. It would need a light or an electron microscope to look at it. So why are cells as small as they are? And the reason for this is that a cell needs to be small enough so that it can easily transport nutrients across it. So if a cell was too big, and say it needed to get nutrients here, and the nutrients are located out here outside of the cell, it could take a long time for these nutrients to travel through the cell into where they need to go. Therefore, the cell needs to be just small enough so that it can grasp and reach those nutrients as needed effectively. But it also can't be too small, because if it's too small, then it's not going to be able to house everything inside of it. So it has a lot of unique cellular structures that we're going to look at. So when we're looking at cells, what I want you to understand is the cell has to be big enough to house all of the little structures it's going to have within it, whatever those structures may be, but small enough so that it still can have nutrients get through it as needed. And this is why we have what is called the surface area to volume ratio. The surface area is the amount of area on the surface of the cell, right? So on this, if you were to look at what's surrounding the cell, that would be your surface area. And your volume is the amount of space within the cell. So you want both of those to be, you want the surface area to be good enough to be able to get things through it, but not too large. And you want your volume inside to be big enough to house everything. You don't need it to be any bigger than that. So your surface area to volume ratio shows you that as surface area increases, your volume remains constant. And what this means is once you achieve the volume you need inside the cell, getting any bigger will not be helpful for you as a living organism, because your surface area increases, making it hard for you to get nutrients inside, but your volume stays the same, which means you can't really house more stuff inside of yourself. Okay, so cells will always remain the size that they need to be. Okay, as I mentioned before, all cells on Earth can be categorized into two major groups, the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. I mentioned that prokaryotes are those that are the first organisms on Earth. It is before true nucleus, so they don't have a nucleus, instead they have a nucleoid. And organisms found within the prokaryotes are your bacteria and your archaea. Okay. We've all heard of bacterial cells before, or bacterial organisms. Usually when we think of bacteria, we think of really bad things like strep throat and other diseases, E. coli and salmonella and gonorrhea and all sorts of bad diseases that we can get. But in reality, there are way more bacterial cells that are non-harmful to humans than there are bacterial cells that are harmful to us. So actually, most of the bacterial cells on Earth will do nothing to humans or not harm us in any way. Some of them are actually very beneficial. For instance, our body has trillions of bacterial cells within us. We can't survive without these bacterial cells within us. They help us so much. They help maintain our immunity. They help with our digestion and absorption of nutrients and vitamins and minerals into our body. They help with the production of vitamins as well. Vitamin K, which is highly needed in our body to be able to clot blood. Yes, we can obtain vitamin K into our digestive system by consuming it from other organisms or food, but it can't actually be absorbed into your bloodstream unless you have a good, healthy flora or gut flora as it's known, which are these bacteria that live in your intestines, and they will help your body absorb that vitamin K into a form that your blood can then use to be able to clot. So if you didn't have that bacteria, you won't be able to get that vitamin K into you, at least not without medical interventions such as injections. Okay. So bacteria are extremely important. They help with our defense, they help with our immunity, they help with our digestion and absorption, they help with vitamins and minerals, they help with so many things in our body. Okay. Archaea are also found in our body, and they're found pretty much all around the world. We know less about them than we do of bacteria, but we are learning more about archaea every day. For now, all archaeal organisms that have been found are all either non-harmful to humans or they are beneficial to humans. We have actually never found an archaea cell that is damaging to humans in any way. So they do not tend to be pathogenic, at least not that we found. Your eukaryotic cells then are going to be those cells that are going to have evolved after the prokaryotes. Again, U means true, so this prefix U means true. Carry a nucleus, which means these do contain a nucleus. And that DNA will be contained within the nucleus of the cell. And we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. Organisms you can find within your eukaryotic cells are going to be four key types: your protists, your plants, your fungi, and your animals. Here in our Bio 111 class, we're going to look at the cells in more depth. We're going to look at different types of prokaryotic cells and the structures we find within these cells. We're going to look at the different types of eukaryotic cells and the major organelles or structures you can find within these cells. All right? And we're also going to talk about the importance of these cellular structures. And then we're going to go into more detail in further chapters about these cells, how they process energy, how they utilize that energy, how they can make energy, for instance, if they're like a plant cell that has chloroplast. Okay. We're going to talk about how they can bring things into the cell and transport them. We look at the plasma membrane into more detail. And we're going to keep looking at the cells and how they're able to do replication through something called mitosis or meiosis, and much more detail about these cells. In Bio 112, if you choose to move on to Bio 112, which is known as General Biology 2, in there we will be looking at these different organisms, these protists, these plants, these fungi, and these animals in more detail. So we don't actually talk about these different animal groups other than to say they belong to eukaryotes and prokaryotes in 111, but in 112 you will learn more about these different organisms. Right, so this is what a generalized prokaryotic cell looks like. And I say generalized because this is in general what it looks like, but not all prokaryotic cells look the same. For instance, bacteria can be round in shape instead of this shape. So this shape is in the shape of a pili. Sorry, not a pili. In the shape of a kind of like a capsule or a pill, okay, or elongated. It's mostly called a rod shape, okay. There are other shapes where they can look kind of spherical, and another shape where they can look kind of like a coil. So there are different shapes that bacteria can be found in, but here I'm just going to give you this generalized idea of what it can look like and what organelles you can tend to find there, or what kind of structures you can tend to find. Okay, so in different structures we can see off bat looking at this prokaryotic cell is right here. This guy is pretty important. This is your DNA. DNA is what is our genetic information. It contains our genes. So it contains everything that codes for what is made in the cell and how that cell will function. And that's all coded there. In humans, for instance, as we are a type of eukaryotic organisms, our DNA will be contained within a nucleus. For the prokaryotic cells, their DNA is just going to be kind of a coil all mashed up together, kind of in the middle of the cell, just hanging out there. It doesn't have a specialized organelle to contain it. You're going to notice some other things around here. We have plasmids here. We've got these kind of looking hair-like structures all around. These guys are known as pili, and these guys are going to be pretty important for being able to transfer information from one bacterial cell to another bacterial cell. And we'll talk about that in future detail later. The bacteria cells will also contain three kinds of coverings to protect them. The first one is going to be this covering here, known as your plasma membrane. This covering will be found in all cells, and I'm not just talking all prokaryotic cells. You're going to find the plasma membrane in all cells, eukaryotes and prokaryotes alike. This is the initial covering that kind of like the skin of the cell that keeps everything inside the cell. The second covering that prokaryotic cells will have is a cell wall, and this protects an additional layer for them. And some of them may contain a capsule on top of that. And this capsule will then be a sticky outer coat that can provide an additional support and allow that bacteria to adhere to different surfaces. Other things we'll find is going to be the cytoplasm, which is basically this fluid-like interior where everything is sitting. And you can see those kind of dots that almost look like measles in the inside of that bacterial. All these little dots here are going to be your ribosomes. Okay. Ribosomes are the site of protein building. So you need a ribosome to make proteins. Therefore, all cells are going to contain ribosomes. So as you look at this cell and you start to look at the different parts of it, I want you to understand that everything that is marked here in blue, like this one, see how this font is blue colored? These are going to be the unique structures of only prokaryotic cells, and I listed them here for you as well. So only prokaryotic cells contain capsules, eukaryotic cells do not. Prokaryotic cells will have a nucleoid. Since they don't have a nucleus, they'll have plasmids and pili. The rest of the stuff that are going to be highlighted in black, so the font is black. All of these things, yes, they're found in prokaryotic cells, but they will also be found in your eukaryotic cells. So for instance, when we look at an idealized eukaryote cell, you can also find your cytoplasm here, which is the liquid-filled interior. You can also find those little red dots, which are those ribosomes. They don't really look red, but they're colored here in these diagrams in red. Okay. Flagellums, which are these whip-like structures that can be used for movement, can also be found in eukaryotic cells. For instance, human sperm cells contain a flagellum, this tail-like structure, to help project those that sperm through the vaginal canal and up into the cervix. So some of these structures will be similar, some of them will be different. Please take time to look at these different structures in your idealized eukaryotic cell. And note here again the unique structures. So these structures are unique for animal cells. And down here we're going to have another image which is going to be your prokaryotic cells. And you can see which structures are going to be, not prokaryotic, plant cells. You can see which ones are unique. So again, we have your prokaryote cells, which are going to be your first cells on Earth, and bacteria and archaea are going to have these types of cells. All the rest of life on Earth will have eukaryotic cells. And for purposes of this class, we're going to talk about two key types of eukaryotic cells, the animal cells and the plant cells. So animal cells will have, may contain flagellum, for instance, and they will have something called lysosomes, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail and are unique to animal cells. They're going to have centrosomes and flagella, which can only be found in animal cells, not in the plant cells. Remember, flagella you can also find in bacteria. And microvilli can be found in animal cells and not in plant cells. So we'll talk about some of these structures in a little bit more detail as we progress through this chapter. For your idealized plant cell, and you can think about any plant, like a tree, grass, daisies, they're all going to contain these type of cells. And you can see here a key structure that is different from what you just saw in this other image. And that structure is going to be this bright green one here. These are your chloroplasts. This is what plant cells will use to make energy, to convert sunlight into sugars. Okay, and we'll talk about photosynthesis in more detail later in the semester. We're going to talk about how these plants actually convert the sunlight into energy. But for now, we will talk a little bit about what a chloroplast is versus what a mitochondria is and how plant cells contain these. Okay, here are those unique structures for the plant cells: chloroplast, cell walls, and central vacuole. Remember that prokaryotic cells may also contain cell walls, but animal cells do not contain cell walls. Plant cells do. Plant cells contain your chloroplast, and plant cells have that central vacuole. Here are some two great videos to watch, and I would highly suggest take a moment to tour this animal cell. Just simply click on this animation to watch it, and you can come over here and click on this animation to watch it. Obviously not in this video that I'm showing you, but within the lecture slides that are attached to this video. Okay, I want you to open those lecture slides and take a moment to actually tour the plant and the animal cell to learn a little bit more about it. I'm going to pause the video here. In the next video, we're going to start talking about some of these specific cellular structures in a little bit more detail and learn a little bit more about their function.